My name is Tina Myers. I'm SMPS's Deputy CEO, and it's my honor to start our program today with all of you. So welcome and thank you truly for your great interest in our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and truly being a part of this conversation. So some of you may not be aware, and we have just been informed that today for this program, we have over 780 registrants for this program alone. So that is remarkable. And what that tells us and what it demonstrates is the true importance of this conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion overall, and that we are truly on the right path in what we are doing and what we are discussing. So again, thank you for being a part of this program and for being a part of this conversation. So some of you may or may not be aware that well over a year ago, SMPS, like many other organizations, put together our own policy, our own philosophy, and words on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there is great work that was put into that. They are great words and they are important words. But what's important for us, and to make sure that you are well aware of, is that these words are not merely rhetoric or something that we have stamped and put up on our website, but that we live them and we apply them. So as an organization, what we want to make sure that all of you know, our members, our stakeholders, our leaders, is that when we speak of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are committed to listening. We are committed to learning. And when we learn and gain that knowledge, we are committed to applying and sharing that with all of our stakeholders and making sure that we are using that to build a stronger SMPS, a stronger AEC community. So with all that said, all of that work that has been done, it has to be said that the commitment of our volunteers and who is leading us in these conversations is the work of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, which is led by Asheya Warren, the chair of that task force. It is now in its second year, and the work that they are doing is amazing, and they are leading us into the right discussions. Alongside Asheya is also our own CFO, Antonio Payne, who is also our DEI advocate. So with Antonio Payne and Asheya Warren and the team of volunteers, their passion shines. And again, I am just so grateful and want to take this opportunity in front of all of you to thank them for their great work on behalf of the society. So thank you, Asheya, for your leadership in this role. So there's only one other thing that I want to share, and it's really kind of a part of my role as the Deputy CEO with SMPS. I have many hats, but primarily my role is about caring for the society and everything that that means. So at this moment in time, I would be remiss to not acknowledge the depth of unrest in our world today. And so let me tell you, even from my own perspective, and maybe what I feel, because I think many of you may be feeling the same thing. Each morning when we wake up, we don't know what our newsfeed is going to show us. We don't know the surprises of the day, and sometimes just how that is making us feel. And it can be daunting and it can be overwhelming. And sometimes when you put those things in perspective and you're trying to weigh what is important to us and then going to work and making sure that that is meaningful work and putting sense to it all, it just feels like such an imbalance. So I think this is a great time to share with you and remind you of a couple of things. And from the words of a past president, Craig Galati, in a strategic planning session of ours a few years back, he used the words representing AEC and all of our members and our stakeholders. that we change the world. What you do working with our architectural firms, our engineering firms, our construction firms, our sister organizations, our alliances, the things that you do right now, relevant then, but so more relevant today, is how you build, you rebuild, you teach and you train, and you even enlighten those who are working with you to build a better world, a better infrastructure on behalf of people, on behalf of the climate, on behalf of the world. And these are the messages that came through in that strategic planning session. But today, in midst of the chaos, it's important to remind ourselves of the importance of the work that you are doing. So, as marketing professionals, as the professionals that represent these organizations, just know that you are very much a part of that change in that making the world a better place. And there is great meaning in the work that you do. So, we change the world. You change the world, and we have a meaningful moment today. So, as you go forward, just remind yourself and ourselves, give ourselves grace. Remember to be kind to one another, and that there is still great and meaningful work to be done at this moment. You are the voice of these industries, and you demonstrate it every day. So thank you for that. So that said, and by demonstrating your commitment, you're a part of this conversation already, I would like to hand this over to our producer to show a video to kickstart a great conversation for today's program.
As part of an experiment to explore the human mind, we asked 22 people to solve the same riddle and recorded their responses. Feel free to participate also. Are you ready?
The riddle. A father is about to bring his son to a job interview, applying for a position at a large stockbrokers company in the city. Just as they arrive at the company's parking lot, the son's phone rings. He looks at his father, who says, "Go ahead, answer it." The caller is the trading company CEO, who says, "Good luck, son, you've got this." The son ends the call and once again looks at his father, who is still next to him in their car. How is this possible?
He gets a call from the CEO, but it says,
"Good luck, son."
But he was next to him.
So it's not the father.
I think it was probably an audio recording of his father.
Maybe he made a demo tape.
Like he has two fathers?
This is a hard one.
Maybe it's a word joke, like it's the grandfather of the son.
No, I think his name is Son.
I don't know.
Maybe it's just like an old man, calling a younger guy son.
I have no idea.
The answer. It's his mother.
Oh, that's so stupid. Yes, of course.
I should have thought of that, yes.
The CEO is a woman.
so I'm biased. In a sense. Is this about diversity and inclusion?
That's really mind-blowing, actually.
So I always thought that I'm not very sexist. But in spite of that, I think these subconscious biases are there in everyone's mind.
How much bias I still have in terms of thinking that the CEO needs to be a man.
Yeah, I definitely was picturing a man.
They identify with males more than females these days.
Why can't women also be CEOs or doctors or, right?
When I think about a CEO or someone that's high positioned within a company, I mostly think of men.
And it's a shame, I think.
And that's so weird, because I'm a CEO, and I'm a woman.
And I want to be a CEO. Why didn't I think about that? Crap.
I believe women can absolutely be CEOs, and that's definitely something that we should work on, especially when you're saying that so many people have been told this riddle and most people haven't gotten it.
Women make great CEOs and great leaders as well. And yet only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Let's change our mindset.
Thank you for teeing us up, Tina, and I appreciate everyone's attendance today. We would be remiss if we did not acknowledge International Women's Day, and that video really does help set the tone for our conversation today and as we celebrate International Women's Month throughout the month of March. In today's conversation, we'll be talking deeply about allyship and how that impacts the AEC world and the work that the DEI Task Force is doing. At the beginning of today's program, we're going to have a deep dive training moment provided by Shantara McBride, who is an educator, an author, and has a heart for girls and women through her Marvelous University program. Right now, I'm going to turn the stage over to Shantara to teach us a little bit about allyship, and then we'll move into our panel conversation. Shantara?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whatever time zone you are in. Hello. And my favorite part about that whole video is when she said, oh, his name must be Sun. I fell out. I cracked. It's like, what? Do we just go? Anyway, good afternoon. It is wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I want to go ahead and dive in because I don't want to waste your time. And I want to make sure that you understand a couple of things. One, what this conversation is not. So this is not a guilt trip. This is not all talk and no room for action. We've met as panelists, so there is action. We're just not here to gripe. And with that said, this is not a gripe session, but it is a place for listening with an open mind, hoping that something is said that will change your mind or give you even some head nods. We also want to make sure that what we're talking about today is not just full of opinion. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about is factual. And I think sometimes we don't offer the opportunity and invitation to partner with your colleagues, with even people on this panel today, with this organization, and not only for, the benefit of others, but also benefits for you and benefits for your customers and the people that you get to partner with and that you serve. I want to make sure that today you will hear different language in our conversation. And one language, I must tell you, in case you can't tell already, but my conversation will be pretty direct. My language is, especially regarding race and identity, will be direct. I used to use Black or African American to identify as a Black person or a person of African descent. And this is not to include anyone, but I found that as a Black woman living in the United States, I just rather say that I'm a Black woman living in the United States. I have not, or I will say that I've done the genealogy thing, and I've also had people tell me, oh, you look like you can be from Nigeria. You look like, and I'm like, thank you, that is such a compliment. But until I know for sure, I go ahead and I'm Black, and that's okay. And I don't speak for everybody on the panel, but I will say for me and mine, you can call me a Black woman. I don't mind. And I've met a lot of people, especially people who are not people of color, kind of stumble. Can I say Black? Can I say, listen, you can say anything but the N-word. Mm-hmm. So I want to go ahead and put that out there. I want to say that because in our history, especially as a country, we've gotten to this place of being comfortable using the term person of color. And that term seems to be safe. And it's really safe, honestly, I think for white people who are not comfortable or not sure or not, so it's this safe term. That's fine too. But if you see me, you can go ahead and say she's a Black woman. I also want to make sure to talk about BIPOC. And I think that is a term that is really gotten in our culture a lot. You'll see it a lot on social media. I haven't seen it a lot on I would say regular television, but BIPOC, and when I first saw it, many people didn't know how to pronounce it. It was kind of like, do we say BIPOC, or do we say, I forget the other ones, but it was kind of weird because we didn't really know how to describe it or how to pronounce it. And so BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And this term reflects and expresses the intersectionality of Black and Indigenous people, especially in America. The phrase people of color dates back centuries and is often abbreviated POC. So the other two letters for Black and Indigenous were included in the acronym to account for the erasure of Black people with darker skin and honestly for Native American people. And even though we understand that African and Indigenous people suffered greatly at the hands of colonialism, they had different experiences and history, especially in the United States. This is important to remember as you hopefully engage in dialogue with other people. Listen, we're all guilty of hearing a single story and believing that that story is the narrative for everyone in that demographic. Because of this, my analysis and advice will at times extend beyond, sometimes well beyond, honestly, my personal experience. I will try to be as inclusive as possible. And if you feel left out or you feel like I didn't address your story, I think this is really important, especially for our chat, that you just chime right on in. I won't be offended. I won't feel any kind of way except for you are speaking up for your identity. And so this is really cool about the way that we're going to participate today, because there is no perfect way. Webinars can be great, especially because you're in your own space and you're listening at your own time. And I also want to say that this is also a great time to even start thinking about people that you want to have conversations with. So with that being said, I don't want to ruffle feathers, and I know that as you don't want to ruffle feathers. And so I want to begin with talking about allyship, because I think ally is a word that many people use. We see it all the time. It's one of those words that we just know what it means, or at least we think we know. But I wanted to use a definition to make sure we're all on the same page, okay? So as a sociology major, many, I'm gonna take off one of the minis, years ago, one of the first terms I learned in my intro to race and ethnicity in one of the classes was the term ally. And it is often defined as a noun, a person who uses their privilege to advocate on behalf of someone else who doesn't hold the same privilege. And with so much talk being geared towards, I would say, non-Black people, and because I told you I'll be frank, to white people on being allies, we have to make sure that we understand that being an ally is more than posting something on social media or sending a text, asking your Black friend if they're okay after another unarmed Black person was killed by police. I say that because it has happened to me more than once. It has happened to me more than twice. It has happened to me a lot. And I think what's really hard is getting the text messages, asking if I'm okay, and then thinking about the person that has sent me the text. And my first response is to make sure they're okay, make sure that my response to them is not going to hurt their feelings. Because I want to say, hell no, I'm not okay. But constantly thinking about, okay, if I say this, will they receive it the same way that I'm saying it? Or am I sounding too angry? Am I sounding upset? I've even had a friend, and we talked about this extensively, ask me, should I send flowers? Should I send your family dinner? And this was after George Floyd was killed. And I was like, no, I don't need flowers. And you can send me dinner, but I mean, no, that's not what we need. We want this to stop. But in her, and I will say defense, I knew that she was coming from a place of, I want this to get better and I don't know what to do. So let me show you a slide, and I'm going to share my screen because I think this definition helps us really hone in what allyship is about. So being an ally is more than being sympathetic towards those who experience discrimination. It is more than simply believing in equality. Because I think we can believe in equality. I think we can be sympathetic about what is happening. But being an ally means being willing to act with and for others in pursuit of ending oppression and creating equality. In other words, an ally is a verb. It's a verb. It's not just posting something on social media. And I remember, do y'all remember that day when everybody posted the black squares on social media? And so I was like, do I post a black square? Is this being an ally to me? Like, it's this confusing because I didn't understand it. And then I thought, well, am I supposed to like it? If I like it, am I saying, yay, good job? Like, right? So a lot of times these social media campaigns of showing what allyship looks like, and it's confusing. And so this definition, and you can screenshot it and you can, whatever you need to do, but especially this last part, it's being willing to act with and for others in pursuit of ending oppression and creating equality. Creating equality. Okay. So I'm going to leave that up. So as we talk, we can think about what that looks like and what that means. And so when I think about being sympathetic, and like I said, friend who wanted to, DoorDash my family, and that was going to take care of the pain that we were feeling, seeing another unarmed Black person killed. Feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune is not being an ally. And when I think about the pursuit of ending oppression and creating equality, being an ally also means that we take some time to become aware of our blind spots. Often think about the examples and the opportunities and the situations I've been in when people wanted to relate instead of validate. They wanted to relate to my experience. And I'll tell a quick story. Years ago, I was working at an organization, and I was living in DC at the time. And this was in DC, this was when DC was known as Chocolate City. I don't know if it can have that, title anymore, but then it was really known as Chocolate City. But I was working with the nonprofit, and we had to go to a meeting that was a lot of foundations. And at that time, I didn't know that basically foundation, the people who had the money, they were white. The people who were working at the nonprofit, they were Black. And so I didn't know, because I was coming from Dallas. So I didn't know. And so I remember going to this meeting, and I wasn't well-versed in small talk at the time. And so I just remember circling the meeting and trying this small talk thing and trying to talk to people. But I was truly one Black person in a room full of people with all the money, right? So I remember getting in the car. I went with our executive director at the time, and I remember getting in the car, and I don't know what made me share my experience with him, but I remember saying to him, "Whoa, I cannot believe that I was the only, Black person in the room." And I was like, it was a little, uncomfortable, And my boss, with great intention, he said, "I understand." Now, I should point out, my boss was a white dude. And so I was clueless. And so he said, I totally understand. And I was like, what do you mean you understand? He was like, well, and he was a gay man. He was out. It was, that was his life. He said, well, as a gay man, I totally know what it feels like to be in a room like that and to be uncomfortable. And I was like, did this man just relate his experience to what I'm saying? Like, did he do that? And the answer is yes, he did. Because he felt like relating his experience to my experience would make me feel more comfortable, would make us, have this great bonding experience. And my thing was no, because in that room, you still identified as a white man. People saw that. You can't mistake who I am. Right. And so but I understood he was trying. No, I didn't understand at the time. At the time, I was really irritated. And I was just like, we can't we can't do this. So we got back to the office and we had a whole staff meeting about it because we needed to understand the difference between validation and relation. And so when we talk about being an ally, oftentimes that means you don't have to relate. You don't have to say, oh, in my, especially if you're a non-person of color, and that's okay. That's okay. You can hear what's going on and you can say, you know what, this absolutely sucks. What can I do to bring equality or to create equality around the table? What can I do to make sure that you don't feel that way again? That's being an ally. Not interjecting your own story, not interjecting your own experience. And that's the hard part. And that's honestly the stuff that people don't get to say at work. Because if we say it at work, we're gonna get called into HR. That's what happens. And I get to say it to you because we get to be in this partnership, but I get to say the hard stuff that oftentimes people at work don't get to say. Now, this is also not an invitation for you to ask people of color and Black people at your job if they felt this way. Don't do that. Okay. Now, the other thing I'll say this quickly so that we can get into our panel. When it comes to being an ally, we have to think about, and as we look at this definition, we really have to think about what can I do to create opportunities? And the hard part about that is that being an ally may cost you your seat at the table. It may cost you your place in the room. And that's really hard. Because no one wants to give up their seat at the table. No one wants to give up their place in the room. And when we talk about, especially on this International Women's Day, and we think about how women have really excelled and again, I couldn't believe when the girl said, "Oh, his name must be Son," because the first thing, and I think also hearing the surgeon Riddle, and women can be CEOs, women can run companies, women can do whatever we want to do. But when you look at the amount of wealth that is created in this country, when you even look at who's getting paid and what the salaries are at the table, they're still not equal. And so when we talk about being an ally, we also talk about are women being paid the same amount at your organization, at your company? Are women of color paid lesser, right? Even if they have more experience? And those are the hard questions. So when I think of allyship, I think of a white woman going in and asking the CEO, I'm just curious, is Shantara, who was hired before me and who has more experience than I do, is she paid more than I am? Or she at least paid the same amount? That's allyship in action. But again, it's different because what we think is sometimes we think of putting up the Black square on social media and somebody liking it, and that's doing our job. So I would like to say, when we think about allyship and when we think about really getting involved and really wanting to change our society and creating opportunity, we think of it as a verb and not just something where we are looking at the Black square on social media and thinking we're doing our job. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantara, for that candid conversation about allyship. And now we want to pivot the conversation into our panel discussion about how we're going to talk about applying allyship to the AEC industries and our work on a day-to-day basis. I want to introduce our panelists and make sure that they are all on screen now. We are joined today by Dr. Giovanna Brassfield. She is a former D&I Vice President for Flatiron Construction and is currently the CEO and Principal Consultant of Brassfield and Associates. She focuses on leadership development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as making sure there are diverse suppliers in our construction supplier networks. Next, we have Sterling Stevens. He is an architect by practice and education, but is now an architectural photographer and is an SPSS member and has had a very interesting career path that has led him now to being an architectural photographer. And finally, we have Derek Mayshore. He is a senior VP with CBRE based out of DC. He is bringing the owner and client and developer perspective to today's conversation, and his experience includes commercial real estate advisory and transaction services. And some of his client and project engagements have included Netflix and the Washington Area Airport Authority. So please join me in welcoming each of our panelists to today's conversation. And we're just going to dive right into this discussion about why allyship is important in AEC. So obviously, as we are building project teams, chasing project opportunities from a marketing and business development perspective, there are many opportunities for us to exemplify and show allyship in action, right? So active allyship in action. So Dr. G, can you give us an example of a time where you have seen active allyship on display and talk about how that has impacted some of the work that you've been involved in?
Thank you, Asheya, to you and the SPSS DEI Task Force for inviting me to be a part of today's really pertinent conversation. That I hope that the attendees that hear these words of encouragement, the definition of allyship, the deep dive that you just highlighted, that there's action that is generated from today's conversation. Because Shantara said it well, we're here to get the kind of the pot stirred, to actually get these words to come to action. So when we think about allyship, the goal of true diversity and inclusion is to create change as resulting in equity for historically marginalized groups or diverse businesses. So when I think about allyship, you ask the question of active allyship, and it's just creating a safe space where others can show up as their authentic selves. So I think about this one particular situation. I'll share my own journey. I had a chance. I was called in to Colorado to meet with the CEO. And in that conversation, of course, we go through the vision, the profitability, the strategy, all those great things that leaders of organizations do. And then he asked me, he said, Dr. G, what could I do for you? I paused. It's like, oh, wow. Now the question's asked of me, what could he do? And I had to be very intentional with my response, very purposeful and very timely. Whereas if you look at timely, meaning there's not many of us African-Americans at the top when you're talking about senior leaders or executive leadership across organizations for AEC. So when he's asking me, what can I do for you? My immediate response was access. If you help me get access, I will excel, right? Because that's what often most times minorities don't have, or even LGBTQ plus communities don't have, is that access. So for those as leaders, as you're hearing about these stories and examples, make sure you take the time to give access, which is another verb, right? The action to giving people the ability to do, because the experience and the goals and what they bring to the table is exceptional, but all they need is that one opportunity for access. Another one is when you're in a meeting, all men, most times, I know our industry, we're in a meeting of men, and there might be that one female or two females. Engage them in the conversation, taking a pause to ask Sarah, to ask Jessica, to ask Mary, what do you think about such and such? Everyone has a seat and a purpose in the room. Or when you're writing the proposals, as amazing professional service providers that you are in attending today's session, when you're writing these proposals, be specific and make sure you're intentional, and including those programs, those charitable organizations that often are overlooked. And it's not because of they're not visible, it's because it's just they're not the popular ones, the pretty one in the room, but they have a huge impact within the community to make a difference. So that is, for me, what active allyship looks like.
Derek, I'm going to loop you into this conversation, particularly from an owner developer, commercial real estate perspective. How can, in deals being done in terms of projects going vertical, how have you seen active allyship in action?
Thanks, Asheya. I want to be unambiguous with our audience. I have been at this for decades, and I don't expect that tomorrow or next week or next year our problems are going to all be solved. That said, there has never, I want to underscore, never been a better time to be Black or a woman in corporate America today than there is today. Okay, period, full stop. I have watched as individual Blacks or women have risen to positions of authority and have had pressure to not select other women or minorities as vendors or partners or participants in the process. In other words, I used to call it the Thurgood Marshall rule. For those of you who aren't old enough, Thurgood Marshall was the only Black justice on the Supreme Court for a really long time. And the thought was that if you had one and you were corporate America, well, that was enough. And so that had been the standard for most of my lifetime. Today, two things are true. One is that there have never been more women and Blacks in decision-making authorities. Our numbers are still tiny, make no mistake about it, but there have never been more women and Blacks in position of authority. Second is that for the first time in a post-George Floyd world, where you're living in a world where the expectation is that those women and Blacks will actually go look for and find other people of color, other Blacks, other women to expand the diversity of their workforce. I'll give you one quick example. I was in a pitch with a pursuit, talked about this with the panel earlier this week. I was in a pitch pursuit for one of the top 10 law firms in the world, extraordinarily large firm. Their presence in DC is 400,000 square feet. When I sat down at the lunch in their conference room with 6 people on Zoom, 6 people in the room, I sat at the end of that conference table and was stunned to discover that the thing that was missing in that meeting were men. I was the only one. There were 13 people making the decision around a 400,000 square foot law firm that was going to have a new space. And half of the people in that room were Black or people of color, and there was only one man. So I just want to say that I'm not naive. We don't live in Disney World, and I don't think that we have to merely show up. I think we're going to have to keep scratching and clawing and banging at that door. But I want to be really clear. I have a daughter who is a executive in a high growth division of a very large company. She's 30 years old. She's got P&L responsibility, and I promise you that no 30-year-old Black girls had those roles a generation ago. So let's acknowledge the challenges. Let's work fiercely to overcome them. But let's also understand that this is an environment that we should be able to leverage.
Thank you for that. Sterling, how can individuals recognize their own individual privilege and power and leverage it to create change?
So I've been very actively involved, especially since college. So I did my undergraduate at Texas A&M. And from the beginning, the administration and a lot of the faculty kind of pegged me as this leader, even though I had no inclination of doing so. And so once they gave me that platform, I actually used that platform to give other people platforms. So for example, we had put together an advisory council for minority students, freshmen and sophomores, would talk with juniors and seniors as well as faculty as well. There was an organization called Women in Construction, and I was actually the only male member that was actually part of that group. But instead of me kind of inserting myself, I brought the leaders of those organizations to the other organizations at large to kind of give them a platform. So I think, using kind of the platforms to kind of give other people's platforms is very beneficial. In architecture specifically, most architects are still disproportionately white. It's still about 80% white, 87% of the supervisors are white. And so I think a lot of it is, a lot of times, people think it's a matter of just simply reaching out to schools without realizing that there's people right next to that work, that there's vendors that they can work with. And so I think they're, working with the very people that are in front of you, because, all of those people had to, had a pretty good climb and to get to where they are. And many of them are much more talented than they kind of given credit for. So I think those are kind of certain ways that people can kind of use their privilege to give other people kind of a platform and kind of give their shine.
So to dig a little bit deeper, there are kind of three types of allyship actions. There's individual, what we can do, to our colleague or with our colleague or coworker, the person that's in the next workstation next to us, right? There's interpersonal allyship, which is, larger group dynamics. And then there's structural allyship, which would allow systems and processes to kind of have a foundation to consider the masses. So Dr. G, in terms of those three types of allyship, how do you see, or where do you see the most opportunity in AEC?
I think it's at all three. All three, everyone can be a true change agent. When you think about just listening in the effort to create a space for others, that's one step. Next step could be looking at our policies, practices, and procedures, inviting others to be part of the discussion. And then one true role of the active allyship is where we build the inclusivity, where we're not just looking or listening, but we are intentionally making effort to bring in those three different areas, right? So I think as an industry, we're way, way behind. We're behind. We've been talking about inclusivity, diversity, equity, equality, all these different terms of which are not new to us. So although we're talking about them now, the goal is to make action, make this a sustainable effort, an intentional effort that, again, we won't be back in this place 10 years from now saying, how do we get back here? Because now the focus is on programs, procedures, policies, retention of workforce, and recruiting a pipeline of new potential diverse talent from different backgrounds. But we also have to be aware of the generational needs. How do we make sure that we are addressing and keeping those? And it's because of the allyship, looking at our policies, practices, procedures, individual conversations, better understanding, listening, educating. The list goes on and on. So all these things that you just highlighted, those three different focuses on allyship, as an industry, we need to take them all on. So I don't think there's one cookie cutter way for addressing that, because we're at a point within industry that we need to have that. And as we are addressing those three areas, there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be missteps. No one's perfect. But the beautiful part is the key is coming together to be better allies. And one would say it would be simple, but it's not done if it was simple. So listening, learning, and being open to conversations. Far too often, those difficult conversations must be held. And then the mistakes that I touched on, the misuse of words, the misuse of action, like Shantira started our conversation off by saying, people didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. Oh, that's all lives matter. But that wasn't the issue at that particular time. It wasn't saying one life is better than the other life. The focus was at that moment critically important to our organization and in our country. Black lives mattered. So it was taking the stance as organizations had to. But then again, the beautiful part is it opened up so many opportunities for other diverse communities that were often overlooked, unheard, to have a voice and a power and a strength to stand up, to speak. And they became the focus on allyship, trying to be that advocate, trying to help with equality for pay, more women on boards, right? That's the big one, 50-50. There's also more research being done, like RAND. I'm on the board of the Center to Advance Equity and Policy. And in that center, there's a lot of research being done to look at equity and policy, and especially with looking at construction and AEC specifically, of how we can be a better industry and building that pipeline, being more equitable. So when you talk about allyship, all three, hands down, there's so many different examples and so many research from Catalyst, from the Harvard Business Review, and I touched on RAND's research as well too. So I think we have a lot to do, but I think this conversation, Asheya, starts, with pivotal points to get those actions generated.
Thank you for that. So Sterling, we are kind of in the midst of a transition as the pandemic is slowly becoming endemic and workplaces are requiring people to come back into the office. We've got the Great Resignation happening at the same time. And our industry has historically had this kind of butts in seats mentality as kind of framework for how we do business. So how can we shift this culture to become a tool for allyship for those who need to show up to work differently? So since you've had kind of an interesting career swing, right? You've had some experiences that probably made you want to step out of studio practice. How does that translate into allyship, and what could have made you stay in your environment and practicing as an architect that maybe we need to think about differently to become allies for mothers, for those who are differently abled, for those who have a different perspective in the world?
So I have probably had one foot outside of architecture pretty much from school through until I eventually left. So, I think one of the things I would say is, especially as someone who's not necessarily outgoing as a personality, is a little bit more kind of outreach from those who kind of have the most in charge. So one of the things that actually did keep me in architecture is I worked for a lot of different kind of large firms. I kept getting pigeonholed. So eventually I started working for smaller firms. And there was a firm here in North Carolina. I sat down with him and he asked, "Hey, what is it that you want?" And I said, "I want everything," basically. And he gave it to me, and it wasn't just a matter of mentorship, but it was also investing in his own business and his own success. So, I wanted to know kind of how the operations work. So he allowed me to do that. I wanted to learn about business development and marketing. He gave me those opportunities. When he saw that I had an interest in photography, he said, "Hey, here's a camera. Why don't you go ahead and shoot these pictures?" And it led to a new career, but, it was a combination of like my interest, but it was also in his interest as well, and investing in his own success. And one of the things that we have an opportunity is, the last couple of years, and also kind of overall as a trend in architecture is, while it has been slow, the field is diversifying. And so what's happening is there are less people going to architecture school, and specifically less white people going to architecture school, and there's an increase in minorities. And this is a fantastic opportunity to go into high schools, to go into colleges. 1 out of 3 African-American students are at HBCUs. And a lot of times when we have these, jobs, job fairs, people tend to go to school where they went to school. Right. So if you didn't go to an HBCU or you didn't go to a certain school, you're not visiting that school. Right. And so, there are opportunities, and also kind of just broadening your spheres of influence. If you have a kind of a diverse sphere of influence, and not necessarily just like at the workplace, but in your personal life as well. So for example, in my business, most of my assistants are women or people of color, and it's not because I necessarily looked for them. They happen to be, people hire who they know. Right. And so, hey, I know Sterling is an architecture photographer. Maybe you can get some experience, things like that. And so, if you're an ally, going across to people that you wouldn't necessarily associate with, not necessarily just people that you go to party with and you don't necessarily have conversations. Right. And those are things that, I've really kind of integrated from the beginning. So in Texas, for example, we had, 3 different schools, and they're all separate: landscape, construction, and architecture. And so just talking with people you wouldn't ordinarily talk to with, and learn to understand them. And they're people that you wind up knowing more people and having more connections. And so when people are like, "Hey, I'm looking for an engineer," there's that person. And that's how that works.
Thank you. Derek, we are kind of talking to a group who is responsible for the professional services marketing in terms of proposal development, in terms of marketing language, in terms of business development strategy. A lot of times our companies have a displayed mission, vision, and value that their firm projects or aspires to be. but sometimes that can be in direct conflict with either the projects that they choose to pursue, the owners they choose to want to have as clients, and possibly the way that they show up in community. What kind of thoughts do you have in terms of projects, project direction, working alongside the owner and developer to make sure there is allyship baked in terms of the way that the work is executed and who's involved in the project?
It's all comes down to one word: relationships. Okay, relationships. Either you have them and you have an opportunity to take advantage of those relationships in a way that creates a win-win for everyone around the table, or you don't. Okay, if you have a relationship, you can make a phone call to an owner and remind that owner that owner has published values that are not aligned with their projects or their staffing or their choices of vendors. If you don't have that relationship, you can't make that phone call. If you have a relationship inside your own organization and that organization is failing to be in alignment with its stated values. Everyone said a year or two ago, boy, we're horrified by George Floyd, and we're going to take steps, and we're going to spend money, and we're going to have more board members, and we're going to have more hiring. And if you've watched and that hasn't happened, how do you make a change inside your own organization? It's relationships. It's if you're a junior person, you certainly have to have a mentor or a senior person, and you can have that conversation. And it's an important conversation to have, not because it's in my interest or your interest, but because we now know unequivocally that A, diverse teams are higher performing teams, but B, most prospective clients are looking for diverse teams. So my hope is that we will all be two things: mindful, conscious, and relentless. Be mindful and conscious about this every day. I don't ever turn down an opportunity to meet with somebody who is younger than me. If they send me an email or they send me a LinkedIn, I respond to that email, I respond to LinkedIn, and I spend time with them. I don't ever let my company, which is Fortune 122, I think, and has made a commitment to spend $1 billion on third-party vendors. I was at a conference in Scottsdale last week and spoke to the CEO and the Chief Diversity Officer about how we're doing, okay? Because I know how we're doing. We're not doing good enough, okay? So personally, in our communities and in our institutions, if we are mindful, we wake up every day, and this is part of who we are. It's part of our DNA, saying, I am going to own making a little progress, making a little difference. I'm going to find a way out of no way. Then you can do it individually, you can do it in your community, you do it in your company, but you have to be mindful, conscious, and you have to be relentless. And it's all about finding those relationships and using those relationships.
I think that's a really good point. I think we lose sight of our power in a lot of different ways, and where, particularly in terms of marketing and business development, where SMPS members can have a louder, more vocal voice. One of those ways is in terms of structuring project teams for pursuits. So Dr. G, I'm going to pivot to you a little bit. We've been doing joint ventures for probably 15, 20 years now on large major projects. And those teams typically have at best 70-30 sort of a split, right? Those numbers can vary. But over the years, those percentage points have not really grown to the point that it's making huge measurable change for those diverse suppliers. So I want to ask kind of a two-part question, because supplier diversity is one of those structural allyship items that we talked about. So number one, how have you seen supplier diversity leveraged successfully in terms of project delivery? And where do you think we need to make some shifts in the way that we approach teaming and project team arrangements?
Such a great question, and a timely question as we're up against all that's about to come through our industry when we're looking at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as other projects that are in the horizon. So, I mean, as practitioners, one of the things that we have is the power of change, the power of thinking, listening, and learning. And so when we just heard from Derek about the things that are being done, to make sure where he's advocating on a larger scale, like making sure the change is happening with the COO and the Chief Diversity Officer, you too, as practitioners and writing the proposals, have that ability. For example, I think back to this one situation working with the marketing director, and we were chasing some hospital work, a firm focused on commercial construction. And in that, she was pulling together the team, right? The team, looking at resumes, going through experience, trying to put together the best team that would get the project. She noticed within her reach, right, with stuff that she was controlling, she said, wow, this proposal team is all white men, all the same age. When you put the little pictures. So she saw the visual. So she asked the business development manager, hey, we need to change this. Because of this client, this belief that we have as an organization, our core value is diversity and inclusion. Also, the owners, one of their focuses on the grading of the proposal is diversity and inclusion, but this team does not reflect what we're trying to convey, who we are as an organization. So again, that voice that she had, just that voice and controlling the write-ups, the narrative, the team dynamic, created change for the overall. So there's those kind of initiatives. And then you're seeing more of a push when it comes to those inclusive programs, because far too often, I might have the project team out there leading the initiative when it comes to diversity and inclusion. But you look back at the organization and it's not that pull. You're like, hey, there's a disconnect between the two. So now organizations and organizational leaders are charged with blending the two, making sure that what you see at the ground level, which is the project and the project teams, represent what the organization pushes, says, and believes, right? And listening, learning. So there's forums being done, forums like today within organizations, where I get many different clients reaching out saying, hey, Dr. G, help me understand business resource groups, employee resource groups. How do we elevate them to help us meet our mission, vision, and values, and also our strategic planning goals for the year or for beyond when we're thinking about years out. It's also engaging those programs far too often that are out there in our communities, ready to work programs, prison to employment, those MC3 multi-craft curriculum programs, grading apprenticeships, or even those small business training programs, looking at bond assistance, all those as practitioners and marketing professionals, we have the ability to engage and think about strategically how to help the DEI practitioner on the team in engaging the vision to be a more inclusive organization. And you also have the opportunity to have the ear of the business development lead, the marketing professional internally, the CEOs and leadership that understand that work is about relationships. Work is about trust, and work is about definitely community. Because far too often we talk about it for forever, this manpower shortage, or excuse me, the workforce shortage. I'll be more inclusive, the workforce shortage. But we're still at the workforce shortage, like almost 15 years later, we haven't done anything. So these kind of intentional practices to build allyship, to help the community show up in your proposals, in the work that you're doing as practitioners and within the organizations, can help you win work, win future work. And then also within your role as the practitioner writing the narrative, you have the ability to change people's lives. Because far too often, there's this one last point I want to leave, is there's often at one point where I remember the business development manager is like, give us stories. We need stories to create this picture and this write-up. And we want to show that we really are about inclusivity. We want to have a person by the name of Jack, who we've taken from a prison incarceration program, gave him an opportunity, sponsored him to the unions, all that narrative, right? But there's a bigger picture. You're changing someone's life. You're giving them an opportunity. You're serving as an ally because you're listening, learning, and making change for individuals to have equity across the board.
You brought up a couple of points for me in recanting that story, because I think it's important that we as SMPS members and the marketing and business development professionals that we are, that we recognize when there are gaps within our organizations and that we need to call that out where we have space and agency to do so. So I know in most major public operations, when there is a public pursuit, there is often a workforce composition form that has to be filled out where you have to literally tabulate out your workforce by race, by gender, and by level in the organization. Those numbers do not lie, right? So if we are so struggling to create and craft this narrative when it actually doesn't exist, there's a whole different level of strategy and work that needs to be done, as opposed to trying to create a proposal strategy when there's nothing there that exists that boosts you up, right? So I do think in terms of this group and this conversation, we have to be mindful when we as marketing and BD professionals see gaps within our organization, see gaps within our proposal strategies. When stuff feels inauthentic, right, that means there's something wrong with the organization that needs to be addressed. And we have that opportunity to make that change. So I do want us to start to think about how we empower our marketing and BD teams to kind of lead the charge and realize, yes, our recruiting materials are lacking. Yes, our recruiting approaches are lacking. Why, when I do these resumes, is everybody from K-State? Like, talk about that sort of a thing and realize that there's some other opportunities for us to kind of engage and change the dynamics of our firms. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that I want to bring into the conversation for us today. One attendee is inquiring about suggestions about shaking up kind of that generational power structure in construction in terms of the philosophy of people kind of working their way up, right? That you have to go through this level and kind of be hazed on the job and get to this point before you can get to a certain level, right? But a lot of times along that pathway, there is nepotism or, friends or upper management that have made kind of a way for a certain type of individual to have an easier climb up that ladder. So does anybody have any story or recollection or advice on how you can kind of upset that heavy upper management decision-making structure?
Well, Aisha, I would say that, again, this isn't going to be easy. It's not going to be fun. When you see something, say something. Now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously reminded us that in order to persuade people, we had to speak to them in a way so that they would be persuaded. We don't want to be right. We want to be successful. Okay. So I'm not suggesting that you whine. I'm not suggesting you go to HR. What I'm suggesting is that you begin to build relationships, because this is now an opportunity where CEOs, to a greater than lesser degree, are sensitive for the first time, sensitive to the idea that diverse teams may produce better outcomes. Okay. And if you're with a leading construction company, then you want to lead, right? So if you are a junior person or a mid-level person, and there's a long history in this industry or this company of nepotism and playing by the same old game in the country clubs and whatever, fine. You have two choices. One, sit there, or two, if you see something, say something. Find relationships and find a way to be persuasive, and then do what I suggested earlier: be conscious, mindful, and relentless.
Sterling, I thought you were going to chime in there.
That was perfectly covered.
Okay.
Yeah.
One other question is, how do you see DEI adapting as things like gender diversity become more common and usual in society? I'm not sure how adapting, so I'm just reading the question that was in the chat, but I do know that in terms of gender diversity the industry is super behind in terms of approaching, ingraining, and understanding how that manifests itself in AEC, particularly probably more so on the construction side. So I do know that there are some certification agencies on the West Coast who are starting to acknowledge LGBTQ certifications that I think we'll start to see roll across the country in terms of supplier diversity. So I do know that we have a long way to go in terms of understanding and appreciating gender diversity, and we've got a lot of work to do on that front. One other question, Dr. G, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to also chime in and say, yeah, you're right. When it comes to LGBTQ+, there is a ally guide. I wish I remember who wrote the ally guide. There's organizations like Build Out California that are at the forefront of sharing different resources that would help if you're interested in learning more about how to be an ally for LGBTQ+ community. And then there's also so many research conducted by the Harvard Business Review. Then there's a phenomenal book that's coming out by Henry Nutt, who looks at construction workforce, and also RAND, as well as Procore, that does a lot of research in this space as well for industry.
Thank you. So because it is International Women's Day and SMPS has an interesting membership dynamic, we tend to have a larger women's group in terms of membership in SMPS. And so I do want to talk a little bit about the dynamic between women of color, Black women, white women in the workplace, and what does that look like in terms of creating allies on both sides. And Shantara, I know you're still kind of in the background there. If you want to chime in on some skills for us to think about what those dynamics look like in the workplace, and talk a little bit about how, you know, as we're working through projects and being colleagues, how can we support each other and have allyship on both sides? Because obviously, women have their own challenge within the workforce in terms of pay equity, in terms of upward mobility, in terms of the glass ceiling. But how does that get complicated when we start talking about the intersectionality of Black women, white women, non-gendered women? Like, how do we deal with the mix?
Ooh, I think my favorite word out of all of that was complicated, because I think it is one of those things where we have to. So I would love to say there isn't competition. I think that that would be false, because I think there is unspoken competition when it comes to I need to be first. And so we go in with this mindset at any job that I need to be first. I need to win. I need to impress the most. I need to be at the table. And when we're coming in with that, I mean, you may get the promotion, but you sitting by yourself. And so I think a lot of times we don't really talk about how difficult it is to participate in this invisible competition. Often as women, when we're working together, it's like, okay, what's the goal for everybody? Like, can we hear what's the goal for everybody? And if someone says, bold enough to say, well, I want to be CEO, like, oh, okay, she said that. What can we do to help you become CEO? Right? But we usually don't ask, what's the goal? We usually just sit back and wait, and we're not having real conversations. And so that really stifles us from participating in growth, in promotion, in moving forward, in calling out the misogyny that we see at our companies. We feel like if we call it out, then they're going to fire us. Well, that's a lawsuit. I mean, you know what I mean? So it's like we instead, we get afraid of participating. We also think that allyship, and I saw this in the chat, is a very political word. And so in order to be safe, we're just going to stay away from it. And so I always think about, if one person is not being treated with dignity, then what makes me think that I'm going to be treated with dignity? If one person in my company, or who I choose to do business with, if I know for a fact that they are not treating, especially a marginalized community, with dignity, what makes me think that they're going to treat me with dignity? And my grandma used to say, just keep living, right? But if we are intentional about making sure that everyone is treated with dignity, if we are intentional about it, even if we think it's political, everything in our society is. Everything. And that, even saying that, that's to make sure that we are silent. But if one person is not treated with dignity, We just need to stay there a little bit because it's coming. But if we make sure that everyone is treated with dignity, then that helps us.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts on that dynamic within the AEC world and just the complication that already exists, Dr. G?
I think I think Shantara just hit it dead on when you're talking about just laying the groundwork, right? If you don't see it there and it's not happening for others, why would you think it would happen down the line? But you just keep living. That, it was so well said. And it's far too often true when you think about organizations, right? Because it happens in the words, but you start looking down and down and down at these numbers. And we talked about just those percentages. And there's still high percent of our industry that is non-diverse, especially at the leadership levels. So how do we change that narrative? And it's these kind of programs and conversations, but more so taking those bold conversations. But no, don't lose your seat at the table at the same time. So it's a really difficult political way, but it's needed for our industry.
That's a good segue into the next question that we have, which I would love for everyone on this panel to speak into. Do you think creating a DEI officer position allows CEOs to shift accountability for that aspect of the business away from themselves, as opposed to owning it as part of their role? And I will chime in on this one is, there are a lot of DE&I roles that are being created that are not necessarily at the C-suite level, right? They are being created in conjunction with HR, as an offshoot of HR, as a figurehead, as a role that is not necessarily empowered to make change within the entire operations of the company. And if you have a role like that really can't do anything, there's no way for them to be successful, let alone does your organization probably even have any metrics developed for what success for that role might even look like, right? So they are at a loss out of the gate. But in terms of CEOs and shifting accountability, it depends on where that level of a position is. If they are at the C-suite level, then that's a different conversation. But I would like everyone else on the panel to kind of chime in on your thoughts in terms of what does a DEI officer position mean for a firm in terms of accountability and business operations?
So I'll jump on in. I think you laid such a great question and a timely question, because I think across industry, everyone wants to have this executive lead, the chief diversity officer, industry to industry. I'm not just pivoting just on construction, but especially in our industry. But far too often, there's a lack of understanding of what that means for that role and that person, or even the resources needed for them to be successful. And I'm talking about a workforce, as well as financial resources. Because once they're in that role, if they don't have oversight and engagement of the needed financials, it's not going to be successful. Or even if they don't even have the support, the true wholehearted support of leadership, going into that room where they're talking to other leaders about the vision and mission and values, the strategic planning of the organization, they're not going to be successful. And it was interesting. I was talking to Rand's executive director of their center on equity. And she said, this is impacting everyone, every industry, where they're bringing in the people who may have been an engineer before in the past. And now you're the expert in DEI. And what does that all mean? You have to blend supplier diversity and you have to blend HR together and now come up with this oversight of employee resource groups and understand how to engage them and keep them all excited. But then you're crowdsourcing the resources. It's just chaotic. It's an absolute disaster. And so what she's looking at is trying to figure out how more research and actually intentional programs can really change the face of how we do business. So that it will be actions, it'll be sustainable, it'll be support for these different professionals that are leading organizations in the diversity and inclusion space. Because or you're seeing this, the training happens. Everyone's excited. Oh, we're going to these trainings. Great. What's changed? Nothing. Besides the check mark that you got on your employee record that you finished the training, but nothing happened within the organization. So now we're being forced as an industry more so to be called to action, called up to action, to be called out to action, to make really sustainable change and intentional actions, rather than just having this figurehead at the top that doesn't have any real real meat in the game or skin in the game to make change.
Derek, you mentioned a conversation that you had with your CEO in terms of your organization and your diversity and equity and inclusion goals. Talk a little bit about your perspective on DEI positions and what that actually looks like.
You've got to have good governance around any initiative. You've got to define success. You've got to provide resources. You've got to hold people accountable, starting at the C level. And you've got to acknowledge that this is new and we aren't good at it. And we're going to fail often, but we need to fail quickly and we need to learn from those failures. My sense is that in our company, our CEO actually wants to get this right. And that doesn't mean that we have gotten it right in the last year or two, but it means that we have tried to do the things that I just said, create structure, accountability, resource, and then learn from those mistakes. My fear is that is not that these DEI roles will be meaningless. My fear is that we will allow ourselves to be discouraged by the initial lack of success of these DEI roles. And my counsel to our community is going to sound a little repetitive, but we're a people who have historically known that we have to make a way out of no way, and that still we rise, and that doesn't come from any lack of discouragement. It comes in spite of discouragement. So let's know that that these DEI roles are going to be more effective in some companies and a little less in others, and let's know that the only way to ensure success is if we take ownership.
Sterling?
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what Derek said. I'm going to speak specifically to architecture because that's what I know. Architects have a lot of kind of utopian ideas of how we serve the public and how we make it more equitable. But it's really challenging to make those environments equitable if we ourselves are not equitable. I think and Derek may be able to speak more on how you actually get the CEO engaged, but it really starts at the top. I haven't been in office in 13 or 14 years, so I can't actually speak to that. But, being from the outside and seeing some of my friends kind of deal with those things, if the CEO is not drawn into this conversation and not engaged, it really does start at the top, and it affects everything. It affects how you represent yourself. It affects, the renderings, it affects the photographs, it affects everything that you're doing to represent your company. And again, if it's on these kind of superficial kind of cover things and you're going for all these proposals, it's going to show through. Even if you don't have those numbers, just psychologically speaking, when you're going through these packages, it's going to show that it's affecting your design. And so if we're really truly invested on doing these things and affecting built environment, it does have to start with the CEO and kind of bring that to the entire firm.
Sterling, that's a huge point. I worked with a client group who was chasing a project in a historically Black, marginalized, underfunded, defunded community. And a huge chunk of that proposal response was, tell us what you know about this community. And instead of being able to articulate what they knew about the community, because they didn't know anything about the community, it was, hey, can you write this for our response? And of course, my response is no, I cannot. This is inauthentic because you're going to try to put up this mantle about knowing what this community needs, what they have been through, and create, again, to your point, a utopian solution for them that is completely rooted in untruths, right? Yeah. So that's a choice in what work are you chasing. If 30% of that RFQ response was tell me what you know about this community, and you technically knew zero, that should have been a no-go, right? That should have been a no-go.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, even if you can't yourself do it and you're invested, find a partner who can. You know, one of my focuses in my master's degree was community participation. And I actually got to do that professionally. So, you know, we had some projects in North Carolina engineering firm. You know, I was working with a certain community and I had experience with community participation. So they hired my firm to actually help out with that. So, you know, you don't have to necessarily do it in-house. Bring someone else who has that capability.
Exactly.
I also think that Sterling's point about the accountability of the CEO cannot be overstated. I had a similar situation as you described, Aisha. There was a project that substantively the architecture firm was exceedingly well qualified to do. However, the client was insisting that the team be diverse. The architectural firm didn't have a lot of experience with that and sent a proposal in that wasn't getting any traction. The CEO called me and I suggested, because I knew the client, that what the CEO should do is send a note withdrawing that proposal, look through his organization and through organizations in his community that were led by minorities, and begin to shape a full partnership between either senior people in his organization who were people of color, or other organizations that he could joint venture with. And that's what they did, because the CEO was invested in trying to find an authentic solution.
So I want to thank you all for joining us in this conversation. We could clearly talk about this for hours, but we are reaching the end of our time period. So if everyone in the chat could do a reaction and a thank you for our lovely panelists. And we are going to I just want to share a few updates in terms of the things that the task force is working on and that are kind of in our future. We have an upcoming event celebrating International Women's Month. If we could get the placeholder pulled up on screen. At the end of the month, we are going to be doing a special program in honor of International Women's Month called I Am Remarkable, in partnership with Google. This is a women's empowerment program. It's open to everyone, but it is targeting women and underrepresented groups, and it's a free workshop open to the first 100 attendees. We will have that registration link dropped in the chat, but that is a Google initiative to just kind of offer and celebrate and empower our members of our organization. So we're pleased to bring that initiative to the group. One other thing that is currently in development by the task force, actually a couple of other things. One is an inclusive language guide, which is actually going to be a tool for our firms to utilize as we are working through proposals and narratives. It is a toolkit that will allow you to think about language inclusively, also imagery, how we market our projects, our teams, our pursuits. So certainly a tangible tactical tool that we are working for to share with the organization. Also, we have talked about this pipeline of cultivating the next generation of students and introducing them to professional services marketing. So I think most of everyone is aware of our scholarship that we launched last year to HBCU students that are majoring in architecture, engineering, construction, communications, journalism. So those students have actually been granted a free 1-year SMPS membership. And so the chapters that are in areas that have a scholarship recipient will be getting some instruction on engaging with those students, because not only do we want to expose them to AEC, we also want to expose them to kind of our lane and our career path, which most everybody kind of fell into. So we want to do that with intention and targeting and making sure that we're reaching a group that typically does not have outreach. The other thing that I think most of you are aware of is this ongoing assessment that we are in partnership with Canaries, which is a data DEI-driven organization. So we are encouraging everyone to use this QR code. I'm going to give you a second to pull out your phone. If you have not completed this assessment right now, I am asking you personally to activate using your QR code and log in and complete the assessment, because it really is going to help SMPS and the task force define our next level of strategy of things that we are going to be doing to serve both the organization as well as our chapters and the industry overall. And I think that brings me to Antonio and Bernice, who are going to offer some closing remarks.
Thank you to Asheya, first and foremost, for facilitating this amazing panel. I know everybody dropped thank yous in for the panel, but Asheya has been hard at work putting most of this panel together and curating most of the content. So what an amazing hour and a half. We could certainly have 3 to 5 more hours of talk on this alone, just from all the engagement in the chat. Some of you put what looked like questions in the chat. So I'm going to encourage you to continue the conversation with me. If you had a question that was posed in the chat that didn't get answered, please email it to me. And I'm going to give away some free things right now for those of you who've hung out with us for a while. Some of you mentioned resources. One of the things that we're going to work on as a task force is providing media resources in terms of books, podcasts, any forms of media that we can use as resources to advance this conversation. And I have 5 suggested books that I'm going to give away. All I ask is that everybody email me your takeaways from today, and 5 of you lucky people will get a book related to DEI. Simmer, did you have that? Yeah, so this is the list, and this is my email. So I just want everybody to send me an email. I want your takeaways from today. If you have questions that didn't get answered, please ask those, and we'll be happy to either answer myself or forward them to the committee, the panelists, to answer. With that, thank you, everybody, for participating, and I'm going to bring in the president of our society, Ms. Bernice Bako, to close us out.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you to you, Asheya, the entire task force. Wow, this was an amazing, amazing panel that you put together today. Dr. G, Derek, Shantara, Sterling, you had me completely engaged, and it was a great conversation. I really, really appreciate the time that you spent with us. Allyship, there's a lot of takeaways, so send them on to Antonio so you can get the books. What I took away was we need to be relentless in this effort. Everyone can be a change agent. Invite others to the conversation and intentionally make efforts to start those conversations. When you think about actively caring for each other and making sure that we pay it forward and bring people to the table and have those give opportunities. I think back to 15 years ago when we talked about having a workforce shortage just in general. And now 20 years later, we made a small dent. We have an opportunity to try again, and this time to do even better job of doing it and really creating that diverse workforce. And because 20 years is going to go by fast, and we have the opportunity to make those changes. I saw a lot of conversation in the chat about what do I do sitting in my seat. Start talking about it with young people. Start bringing the people who are going to make the future into our industry. There's a lot of opportunity to start paying it forward and create those opportunities for others. And as Tina so eloquently put when we first started, there is great meaning in the work that you do. Take that away. There's great meaning in the work that you do. And I'm going to add that there's great meaning in the person that you are. So let's go out there together, be kind, have a good time doing what we got to do, and pay it forward. And thank you for joining us today.